The biting crack of a pistol shot froze the crowded saloon, silencing the raucous laughter and tinny piano music in an instant. Katherine Novak felt her blood run cold as her brother Thomas stumbled backward into her arms, his face drained of color but thankfully still alive. The bullet had merely grazed his shoulder, a warning shot from Silas Langdon, the most feared moneylender in Leavenworth, Kansas. "I want my money by tomorrow noon, Novak," Langdon snarled, his thin lips curled beneath a meticulously groomed mustache. "Every last cent of the $500, or the next bullet won't miss." He holstered his pistol and adjusted his brocade vest. "Bring it to my office, otherwise I'll take what's owed in other ways." His eyes lingered on Katherine, the threat unmistakable. The year was 1878, and Leavenworth had grown from a frontier outpost to a bustling river town where fortunes were made and lost daily. Thomas had gambled away everything their parents had left them, including the deed to their modest homestead just outside town, thinking he could multiply their inheritance. Instead, he'd fallen into Langdon's web of high-interest loans and rigged card games. As the saloon resumed its normal cadence, Katherine helped her brother outside into the cool April evening. At 22, she had already weathered more hardship than most twice her age, but nothing had prepared her for this. "I'm sorry, Katie," Thomas whispered, using the childhood nickname she normally detested. His eyes were glassy with unshed tears. At 25, he looked like a broken man. "I've ruined everything." Katherine guided him down the boardwalk toward Dr. Miller's office. "We'll find a way," she said, but the words felt hollow. They had nothing left to sell or pawn. The next morning dawned clear and bright, mocking the darkness of their situation. Katherine had spent a sleepless night tending to Thomas's wound and calculating impossible sums. They were still $400 short and time was running out. "You should leave town," Thomas said, his face gray with pain and guilt. "Go to Aunt Martha's in St. Louis. I'll face Langdon myself." Katherine shook her head as she changed his bandage. "He'd kill you, and I'm not leaving you." The knock at their door came just after 10 o'clock. Katherine's hand trembled as she opened it, expecting Langdon's thugs. Instead, a young woman named Clara from Madame Rosalie's establishment stood on their porch, her painted face solemn. "Madame sent me to make an offer," Clara said quietly. "She heard about your troubles." Her eyes flicked to the floor. "She says a girl like you could work off your brother's debt in 6 months, maybe less." Katherine felt the blood drain from her face. Madame Rosalie's was the most notorious brothel in Leavenworth. "I can't," she whispered. Clara shrugged. "Beats watching your brother die." She turned to leave. "We're on Pine Street if you change your mind." Katherine closed the door and leaned against it, trembling. Was this truly what their lives had come to? At 11:30, with no other options, Katherine pinned up her chestnut hair and donned her mother's best dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been elegant. She wrote a note for Thomas, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, telling him she was going to negotiate with Langdon. It wasn't entirely a lie. Silas Langdon's office was above the First Mercantile Bank in a building that loomed over the main street like a vulture. Katherine climbed the stairs, her legs feeling heavier with each step. She had no plan beyond begging for more time. The outer office was empty except for a bored-looking clerk who waved her through to Langdon's private quarters without looking up from his ledger. Katherine hesitated before the ornate door, then knocked. "Enter," came the muffled command. Langdon sat behind a massive oak desk, looking unsurprised to see her. 2 men flanked him, one a hulking enforcer, the other a well-dressed associate with calculating eyes. "Miss Novak," Langdon gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "I presume you've brought my money," Katherine swallowed hard. "Mr. Langdon, I need more time. My brother is injured and by my hand, yes, a reminder of the seriousness of his obligation." Langdon leaned forward. "I don't give extensions, Miss Novak." "Please," Katherine forced herself to meet his gaze. "We'll sell the homestead." "We just need a few weeks to find a buyer." Langdon's lips thinned. "That property is already essentially mine, given the papers your brother signed as collateral." He studied her for a long moment. "However, there may be another way to settle this debt." Katherine felt a chill despite the stuffy office. "What way?" "You're an attractive young woman," Langdon said, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Madame Rosalie is a business associate of mine." She's always looking for new girls, and she pays handsomely for those with refinement. Catherine's hands clenched in her lap. You want to sell me? I prefer to think of it as reassigning the debt. Langdon's smile didn't reach his eyes. Your brother owes me $500. Madame Rosalie will pay that and more for a contract on your services. For how long? Catherine whispered. Until she recovers her investment. A year, perhaps two. Langdon shrugged. The alternative is that I take your homestead today and your brother still owes me nearly half the debt. I might be forced to have my associate here break a few bones to encourage prompt payment. The enforcer cracked his knuckles for emphasis. Catherine felt her world tilting. She had come expecting to beg, not to be bartered like cattle, yet what choice did she have? Thomas would never survive if Langdon's men came for him. If I agree, she said carefully, you'll consider Thomas's debt paid in full. You'll leave him alone. You have my word as a businessman, Langdon replied, already reaching for a document in his drawer. The contract will be between you and Madame Rosalie. Your brother will be free and clear. Just as Langdon was pushing the paper toward her, the office door swung open without a knock. Catherine turned to see a tall man filling the doorframe, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides. He wore a dust-covered duster coat, and a weathered Stetson cast a shadow over eyes that seemed to take in the entire room in an instant. Langdon, the newcomer said, his voice a low rumble that held unmistakable authority despite its softness. Heard you were conducting business that might interest me. Langdon's face darkened with annoyance. Vaughn Pierce, this is a private meeting. Catherine studied the intruder. Vaughn Pierce stood easily over 6 feet, with the lean, hard build of a man who lived in the saddle. His face was tanned and weathered, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw darkened by stubble. Despite the trail dust, there was something quietly commanding in his bearing that made even Langdon's enforcer straighten slightly. Selling women ain't private business in my book, Pierce said, stepping fully into the room. His spurs jingled softly as he moved. Especially not decent women with no choice in the matter. Catherine felt a flash of indignation. I have a choice, she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Pierce's gaze settled on her, and Catherine was struck by the intensity of his gray-blue eyes, not cold like Langdon's, but sharp and assessing. Do you now? He asked quietly. Before she could respond, Langdon slammed his palm on the desk. Pierce, you're interfering in a legitimate business transaction. Miss Novak's brother owes me $500. She's choosing to settle his debt. By selling herself, Pierce clarified, his tone flat. It's not your concern, Langdon snapped. Pierce reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet. How about making it my concern? He counted out bills onto Langdon's desk. $500. The debt is paid. A stunned silence fell over the room. Catherine stared at the money, then at the stranger who had produced it so casually. Even Langdon seemed momentarily speechless. What's your angle, Pierce? Langdon finally asked, suspicion evident in his voice. You looking to claim her for yourself, because Madame Rosalie will pay $700. Something dangerous flashed in Pierce's eyes. The debt is paid, he repeated. Miss Novak is free to walk out that door. That's the only angle. Catherine found her voice. Why would you do this? Pierce glanced at her. Madam, a man who'd sell a woman to pay a gambling debt isn't fit to breathe the same air as decent folk. I'm just evening the scales a bit. Langdon's fingers hovered over the money. And what do you want in return from Miss Novak? Nothing, Pierce said simply. Not everyone has an angle, Langdon. He turned to Catherine. Madam, if you'd like to leave, I believe your business here is concluded. Catherine stood on shaky legs, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. My brother's debt, it's truly settled. Langdon nodded reluctantly, pulling the money toward him. It appears so, though I'd keep that wastrel brother of yours away from my establishments in the future. Count on it, Catherine said, finding a moment of steel in her relief. She turned to Pierce, searching for words. Mr. Pierce, outside, he said quietly, gesturing toward the door. Catherine preceded him down the stairs and onto the boardwalk, feeling as though she were walking in a dream. When they reached the street, she turned to face her unexpected savior. I don't understand, she said honestly. Why would you pay my brother's debt? You don't even know us. Pierce adjusted his hat against the midday sun. Don't need to know you to know what's right, Miss Novak. But $500 is just money, he finished for her. Had a good run at the cattle markets in Dodge. Was heading back to my spread up north when I heard talk in the saloon about Langdon's latest victim and his sister. His expression darkened. Men like Langdon are a disease on decent towns. Katherine studied him, still searching for the catch. No one in her experience gave away such a sum without expecting something in return. I insist on repaying you, she said finally. I don't know how or when, but no need, Pierce cut her off. Consider it settled. I can't accept charity of this magnitude, Mr. Pierce. A hint of amusement touched his eyes. Stubborn, aren't you? Fine, you can repay me by keeping your brother away from gambling tables and making something of that homestead of yours. I hear you have good land that could produce if worked right. Katherine blinked. How do you know about our land? Small towns talk, he said simply. He touched the brim of his hat in a brief salute. Good day, Miss Novak. Before she could respond, he turned and started walking toward the livery stable at the end of the street. Wait, Katherine called, hurrying after him. When he paused and turned, she said, At least let me thank you properly. Come to dinner tonight. It's the least I can do. Pierce seemed about to refuse, then something in her expression changed his mind. All right, he agreed. But only because I suspect you'll chase me all the way to the Dakota Territory if I don't. A small smile, the first in what felt like ages, touched Katherine's lips. 7 o'clock. The homestead is 2 miles east of town, just past Willow Creek. Pierce nodded once. I'll find it. As Katherine watched him walk away, she felt something unfamiliar stir within her, not just gratitude, but a curiosity about the man who would pay a stranger's debt and ask for nothing in return. Thomas was sitting up when Katherine returned home, his face drawn with worry. Where have you been? He demanded. Your note said you were going to see Langdon. I was about to come after you, injured or not. Katherine sat beside him on the bed, still in a daze. It's over, Thomas. The debt is paid. What, how? She recounted her meeting with Langdon and Pierce's unexpected intervention, leaving out the part about nearly being sold to Madame Rosalie's. Thomas didn't need that burden of guilt. I don't understand, Thomas said when she finished. Why would this cowboy help us? I don't know, Katherine admitted, but he's coming to dinner tonight and you can thank him yourself. Thomas's eyes narrowed. You invited him here, Katie. We don't know anything about this man. What if he expects compensation? He doesn't, Katherine said firmly, though a shadow of doubt crossed her mind. He seems different. No man gives away $500 for nothing, Thomas argued. Katherine stood and smoothed her dress. Well, we'll find out tonight. In the meantime, I need to figure out what to feed a man who just saved us from ruin. The hours before dinner passed in a flurry of activity. Katherine cleaned their modest 2-room cabin until it shone, killed and plucked one of their precious chickens, and put together a simple but hearty meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, and the last of her preserved peaches. It wasn't fancy, but it was the best they could offer. At precisely 7 o'clock, the sound of hoofbeats announced their visitor's arrival. Katherine smoothed her hair pinned up simply but neatly and straightened her clean calico dress before opening the door. Vaughn Pierce had cleaned up considerably since their meeting in Langdon's office. His dark hair was damp and combed back, his face freshly shaved, revealing a strong jawline previously hidden by stubble. He'd exchanged his trail-worn clothing for a clean white shirt, dark vest, and dark trousers. He still wore his gun belt. Katherine noticed a necessity rather than a statement in these parts. Miss Novak, he said, removing his hat as he dismounted. In his other hand, he held a small package wrapped in brown paper. I hope I'm not late. Right on time, Katherine replied, surprised by her sudden nervousness. Please come in. Pierce tied his horse, a magnificent bay gelding, to the hitching post and followed her inside. Thomas was sitting at the table, his injured arm in a sling, his expression guarded. Mr. Pierce, this is my brother, Thomas Novak, Katherine said. Thomas, this is Vaughn Pierce. The two men sized each other up before Thomas extended his good hand. I owe you my life, Mr. Pierce, though I admit I'm puzzled by your generosity. Pierce shook Thomas's hand briefly. No need to make more of it than it is. He turned to Katherine, holding out the package. Brought something for dinner, nothing fancy, just some coffee beans from a plantation down in Brazil. Picked them up in Kansas City last month. Katherine accepted the gift, touched by the gesture. Thank you. Real coffee is a luxury we don't often enjoy. Dinner was initially awkward, with Thomas watching Pierce suspiciously and Katherine trying to maintain pleasant conversation. Pierce himself seemed content to eat quietly, complimenting the food but offering little about himself until Thomas finally asked directly, "So what's your story, Pierce? You're not from around here." Pierce set down his fork. "Got a cattle ranch about 100 miles north, near the Nebraska border. Nothing too grand, 800 acres and about 300 head. Do a drive to Dodge or Kansas City once a year. And you just happened to be in Langdon's office when my sister was there," Thomas pressed. "Thomas," Katherine warned. Pierce didn't seem bothered by the questioning. "Heard talk in the Silver Dollar that Langdon was setting up to sell a young woman to clear a debt. Didn't sit right with me." His eyes hardened slightly. "Lost my younger sister to a similar situation years back in Texas. By the time I found her, it was too late." The simple statement hung in the air, answering the question of his motivation more clearly than any lengthy explanation could have. "I'm sorry," Katherine said softly. Pierce nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. "It was a long time ago. But it left me with certain views about men who profit from women's desperation." He looked directly at Thomas, "and about men who gamble with more than they can afford to lose." Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. "It won't happen again," he said quietly. "I've learned my lesson." "See that you have," Pierce replied, not unkindly. "Your sister shouldn't have to pay for your mistakes." The remainder of the evening passed more comfortably as they discovered Pierce was well-traveled and full of stories about life on the frontier. He spoke intelligently about cattle breeding, new farming techniques, and the changing landscape of the West as the railroads pushed ever farther. "Your land here has good potential," he observed as Katherine served her peach preserves. "The soil's rich, and you've got reliable water from the creek." "What are you planning to do with it?" Katherine and Thomas exchanged glances. "We've mostly been subsistence farming," Katherine admitted. "A few crops, chickens, a milk cow. Our parents had bigger plans before they passed, but we've just been trying to hold on." Pierce nodded thoughtfully. "You should consider planting alfalfa in the north field. Good crop that builds the soil and feeds livestock. Could turn a decent profit within a year." The conversation turned to practical matters of farming and ranching, with Pierce offering suggestions based on his experience. By the time he rose to leave, the initial tension had dissolved, replaced by a tentative friendship. "Thank you for dinner," Pierce said at the door. "Best meal I've had in months." "It's nothing compared to what we owe you," Katherine replied. Pierce studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'll be in town for another day or two, settling some business. Perhaps I could stop by tomorrow. I noticed your fence line could use some work, and that shoulder isn't going to let your brother do much for a while." Before Thomas could object, Katherine nodded. "We'd appreciate the help." After Pierce had ridden away, Thomas closed the door and turned to his sister. "You're smitten with him," he accused. Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Don't be ridiculous, I'm grateful, that's all." Thomas said skeptically. "Well, I still don't fully trust him, but I admit he seems decent enough, and we could use the help with the fence." True to his word, Pierce returned the next morning, his sleeves already rolled up for work. Over the next 3 days, he not only repaired their fence, but also helped mend their leaking roof, fixed the broken axle on their wagon, and tilled the north field in preparation for the alfalfa he'd suggested. Katherine found herself watching him as he worked, admiring not just his physical strength but the quiet competence with which he approached each task. He didn't waste motion or words, but when he did speak, his observations were thoughtful and often laced with dry humor. On the evening of the third day, as they sat on the porch after another simple but satisfying dinner, Pierce announced that he would be leaving the following morning. "My foreman can handle things at the ranch for a while, but I should be getting back," he explained. Katherine felt a surprising pang of disappointment. "We can never repay you for your kindness, Mr. Pierce." "Vaughn," he corrected gently. "After sharing your table for 3 days, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Vaughn," she repeated, liking the sound of it. "I'm Katherine." "Though most call me Kate," he nodded. "Kate suits you better than Katherine, strong and straightforward." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "Would you write to me?" Vaughn asked suddenly. "Let me know how the alfalfa does." Katherine turned to him, surprised by the request. You want me to write to you, if you wouldn't mind, he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice for the first time since she'd met him. I'd like to know how things turn out here. I'd be happy to, she replied, feeling an unexpected warmth at the thought of maintaining a connection with him. The next morning, Vaughn left them with a sack of alfalfa seed, detailed instructions on its planting and care, and his address. As he mounted his horse, he hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a book. Almost forgot, he said, handing it to Katherine. Thought you might enjoy this, noticed you didn't have many books. It was a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. My mother's favorite, he explained. Thought you might like it too. Katherine ran her fingers over the embossed cover. I can't take your mother's book. She'd want someone to read it, Vaughn said simply. It's been sitting in my saddlebag for too long. As he rode away, Katherine held the book to her chest, wondering about the complex man who carried Jane Austen in his saddlebags and paid strangers' debts without hesitation. The weeks that followed were filled with hard work as Katherine and Thomas, whose shoulder was healing well, implemented Vaughn's suggestions for their farm. They planted the alfalfa, repaired long-neglected fences, and began clearing additional land for cultivation. Katherine wrote to Vaughn as promised, detailed letters describing their progress, the weather, and local happenings. To her delight, he wrote back not as frequently or as lengthily, but his letters were thoughtful, often including practical advice or observations about his own ranch. As spring turned to summer, Katherine found herself watching eagerly for the mail rider, her heart quickening whenever a letter arrived bearing Vaughn's now familiar handwriting. Their correspondence gradually became more personal, with Vaughn sharing stories of his childhood in Tennessee and his journey west after the war, while Katherine wrote of her dreams for the farm and memories of her parents. In late August, a letter arrived that made Katherine's hands tremble. I find myself thinking of Leavenworth often, Vaughn had written, or more precisely of a certain farmstead east of town. The alfalfa should be ready for its first cutting soon. Perhaps I might ride down to see it for myself, say the second week of September. Katherine read the letter 3 times, trying to calm the fluttering in her chest. She showed it to Thomas, who had gradually warmed to Vaughn through their correspondence. You should tell him to come, Thomas said with a knowing smile. The alfalfa does look promising. It's not about the alfalfa, Katherine admitted, blushing. I know, Thomas replied gently. And that's all right, Kate, he's a good man. Katherine wrote back that evening, trying to keep her tone casual as she invited Vaughn to visit and see the results of his advice and assistance. When September arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and golden light, Katherine found herself watching the eastern road whenever she had a spare moment. The farm had been transformed in the months since Vaughn's visit. The alfalfa field was lush and ready for harvest. They had added a small herd of goats for milk and cheese, and the vegetable garden had yielded bountifully. On the afternoon of September 10th, Katherine was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She turned to see a familiar figure on horseback coming up their lane, and her heart seemed to skip a beat. Vaughn looked much as she remembered, tall and straight-backed in the saddle, his face tanned from the sun. As he drew closer, she saw that he'd had his hair trimmed and was freshly shaved, much as he had been for their first dinner. Hello, Kate, he called, dismounting in one fluid motion. Vaughn, she replied, suddenly shy despite months of correspondence. Welcome back. He led his horse toward her, his eyes taking in the improvements to the farm. The place looks good, you've been busy. We took your advice, she said, smiling. It's made all the difference. Thomas emerged from the barn, waving a greeting. After handshakes and pleasantries, he made an excuse about checking fences in the south pasture, giving Katherine and Vaughn some privacy. Would you like to see the alfalfa? Katherine asked. I would, Vaughn replied, though his eyes remained on her face. They walked together to the north field, now a sea of purple-flowered plants nearly ready for harvest. Vaughn knelt to examine the crop, nodding with approval. You've done well, he said, standing. Better than I expected for a first planting. We had good instructions, Katherine replied. And we've been lucky with the weather. They stood at the edge of the field, a comfortable silence between them until Vaughn finally spoke. I didn't come just to see the alfalfa, he admitted. Katherine's pulse quickened. I didn't think you did. Your letters. He paused, searching for words. I've never been much for writing, but I found myself looking forward to yours, reading them over more than once. I've done the same with yours, Katherine confessed. Vaughn turned to face her fully. I don't have a way with words, Kate, never have, but I think there might be something worth exploring here, between us. Katherine met his gaze, seeing vulnerability beneath his usual confidence. I think so too. I'm not a wealthy man, he continued. My ranch is modest, though it's growing. I work hard and the life isn't easy. But it's a good life and an honest one. I never cared about wealth, Katherine said softly. Vaughn reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite his calloused palm. I'd like to court you properly if you're willing. I know there's distance between us, but I believe we could make it work. Katherine felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the September sun. I'd like that very much. Over the next 4 days, Vaughn helped with the alfalfa harvest while continuing his courtship of Katherine. They took walks in the evenings, talking for hours about books, dreams, and their views on life. He told her more about his ranch, the house he'd built with his own hands, the spring-fed creek that ran through the property, the plans he had for expanding his herd with better breeding stock. On his last evening in Leavenworth, they sat on the porch swing as twilight deepened into night. Thomas had tactfully gone to bed early, leaving them alone. I've been thinking, Vaughn said, his arm resting comfortably around Katherine's shoulders. It's a long ride between our places. Letters are fine, but they take time. I know, Katherine sighed. I was just thinking how hard it will be to say goodbye tomorrow. What if you didn't have to? Vaughn asked quietly. Katherine turned to look at him. What do you mean? In the silver moonlight, she could see him swallow hard before continuing. I mean, what if you came back with me as my wife? Katherine's breath caught. Vaughn, I know it's sudden, he hurried on, and if you need time to think on it, I understand, but I know my own mind, Kate. These past months of writing to you and these days with you, I love you, I want to build a life with you. Katherine felt tears welling in her eyes. But what about Thomas, the farm? We've worked so hard. Thomas could come too if he wants, Vaughn said. There's plenty of work at the ranch. Or he could stay here, run this place. Either way, we'd make it work. He took both her hands in his. I'm not asking you to abandon your brother or everything you've built. I'm asking you to let me be part of your future. Katherine searched his face in the moonlight, seeing nothing but sincerity in his eyes. 6 months ago, she had been on the verge of selling herself to save her brother. Now she was being offered a life with a man who had asked for nothing but had given everything. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. The following morning, after a long discussion with Thomas, decisions were made. Thomas would stay and continue working the farm, using the profits from the alfalfa to expand their operations. Katherine and Vaughn would travel to the county seat to marry, then continue on to his ranch. They would visit regularly, especially once the railroad connection was completed the following year, making travel easier. Are you sure about this? Thomas asked Katherine privately as she packed her few belongings. You barely know him. Katherine smiled, thinking of the letters that had revealed Vaughn's soul to her more clearly than years of casual acquaintance might have. I know him well enough, she said confidently, and I love him. Thomas embraced his sister. Then I'm happy for you, and grateful to him not just for paying my debt, but for giving you the happiness you deserve. 2 days later, in a small ceremony at the county courthouse, Katherine Novak became Katherine Pierce. As they left the building as husband and wife, Vaughn paused on the steps. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a simple gold band set with a small sapphire. This was my mother's. I've been carrying it since I left to come see you. Hoped I might have reason to give it to you. As he slipped it onto her finger alongside the plain gold band they'd purchased for the ceremony, Katherine felt tears of joy well in her eyes. I didn't bring you anything, she said softly. Vaughn cupped her face gently. You've given me more than you know, Kate, a reason to come home, a future to build. He kissed her tenderly. That's worth more than all the gold in Colorado. As they rode north toward their new life together, Katherine reflected on how strangely fate had worked. Her brother's debt, which had seemed like the end of everything, had led her to the beginning of something beautiful. And the cowboy who had asked for nothing had ended up gaining everything, as had she. 3 years later, Katherine stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as Vaughn taught their 2-year-old son James to ride his first pony. The ranch had prospered under their joint care, expanding to nearly 1,200 acres with a growing reputation for quality stock. Thomas visited regularly, bringing news of his own success with the farm and his courtship of the schoolteacher in Leavenworth. As Vaughn lifted little James down from the pony and walked toward her, their second child growing beneath Catherine's apron, she thought about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. From the darkest day of her life had come its greatest blessing. "What are you thinking about?" Vaughn asked as he joined her on the porch, setting James down to toddle inside for his afternoon nap. "About Langdon's office," Katherine replied. "About how close I came to a different life." Vaughn's arms slipped around her waist. "I thank God every day that I heard those men talking in the saloon." "So do I," Katherine said, leaning into his embrace. "So do I." In the golden light of the autumn afternoon, with the future stretching bright before them, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that some debts could never be repaid, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came when nothing was asked in return.